WLFE DB Radio.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are go.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's getting nice and heavy.
And now, welcome tonight's host, Jon the Vernomatic Verno.
Good evening, everybody, and happy holidays to all. We invite you to visit the MetalMayhemROC.com website. There you'll find direct streaming links to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. While you're there, sign up for our email list. That's our way to stay in touch with you. Download some past shows, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast. Recent episodes, last week we had Frank Bello of Anthrax talking about his brand new book. Me and the guys went down to New Jersey, hung out with the guys from Raven, and we are doing our continuing series, History of Metal, and we did the year 1980. That leads us into tonight's show. We're continuing that series. We're doing the year 1981. A lot of great stuff going on in 81. Sabbath had that Mob Rules, the last one with Dio for that first chapter. Ozzy with Diary of a Madman. Rush with their moving pictures. The heavier stuff, SAXON, Denim and Leather. Let's see, what else was out there? MAIDEDN, Killers, and Motorhead, No Sleep to Hammersmith. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in 81. I will be joined with Metal Mayhem ROC correspondent Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke from the band MOTORLORD. These two cats have been helping me navigate this series, and we're up to year 1981. I just want to remind you about two kick-ass radio shows. Monday nights, I host a live radio show on thatmetalstation.com. It's 3 hours of metal. There's a chat room. You could sign on, get in there, talk with other bangers around the world. It's a real cool time. If you haven't checked it out yet and have kept hearing this, well, get over there and hang out with us. And the other shows are on the weekends. Friend of ours, Mark James, he's been in broadcasting for 30 plus years, putting these metal shows together. He has two kick-ass shows. One on Friday night called Metal Mark's Vault, where he's specializing in rare and classic metal. But then he regroups and comes back on Saturday for Metal Mark's Audio Aggression. This is new music from up-and-coming bands and the classic bands that have new music. So these two shows are on the weekends. Mine's Monday night. Mark's is Friday and Saturday. And you could just circle back to the MetalMayhemROC.com website, and there we have links and information to listen to both of these shows. It's real easy. We make it easy on everybody. So that being said, let's get into tonight. We're doing the history of metal, the year 1981. Let's welcome Metal Mayhem ROC correspondent Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke of the Central New York power band MOTORLORD. Hey guys, happy holidays. How you doing?
Metal Walt calling in from Jersey, feeling good. Ian, hope you're doing well as well.
Hey there, brother. I'm doing all right. Hope you're doing well. Verno, glad to see you're feeling better.
Feeling much better. Little rest and relaxation goes a long way. Tonight we are tackling the year 1981. 1980 was jam-packed with stuff, and 81's even bigger and better. Walt, why don't you get things started tonight?
So 1981 is the year. 1980, in retrospect, from our last episode, boy, that was a big, giant year. And that one was going to be very hard to top if you think about it, from the releases to where that pinnacle of metal was at that stage. But I must say that I think 1981 comes very, very close to 80. I think you saw releases that were even bigger from some of the same artists where you didn't think they could top what they did in 80. Well, they did it in 81. And I'm thinking artists like Ozzy, Rush, ACDC, and Def Leppard. You saw a lot more of the same in a really great metal way from the top bands out there. Black Sabbath, Saxon, Van Halen, Maiden, and Judas Priest all put out stellar material in 81. And then we also had some memorable live albums, ones that you look back at many years later and you say, this is one of those staple live albums that defines their catalog. And the bands that released those albums were Motorhead and Rush. I think we also saw, as I've mentioned before, the continuation of the trend of bands releasing material on albums that also became not only radio friendly, but video friendly. And it put them on the map in a slightly different way. And I think you think of bands like Blue Oyster Cult, April Wine, and Rainbow, to name a few. These were bands that had MTV hit videos, which were on consistent airplay. And a lot of the listeners learned about these bands through that channel, maybe not even necessarily buying the albums or hearing it on the radio. I think you also saw stellar releases, the bands such as Sammy Hagar and Triumph and Y&T and MSG and Riot. These were all those bands that were just getting established in the late 70s, early 80s, and they're really kicking it into high gear. And then when you imagine the debuts that came out in 1981, and this was really the beginning of the landscape of what would come towards the middle to late 80s and the classic 80s type bands. So we get releases from Motley Crue, Dokken, and Kix, Loudness, and then more on the heavier side, you have Raven and Anvil with their debut releases, and even Venom. I will say I'll give a special call out in an odd kind of way to some of, let's say, the more classic rock artists that had a harder edge, again, that were radio and MTV friendly, but also had really, really good hard rockin' type songs. And I think of, 1981, you have Billy Squier and Pat Benatar. Those are just a few of the artists, Joan Jett even to a degree, that really, really also kind of slid into that category. And I had a real appreciation for. So I think what we can really say is 1981 was very similar to 1980. And I think even in years to come, 1982 will even be just more of the same in a fantastic way. So on to getting into the reviews. I think we're going to get it started here and then also have a break in the show where we're going to talk about the honorable mentions and then come back for, let's say, the top 5 albums for 1981. So, Ian, Motorhead.
Yeah, Walt, you said it. 81, continuation of more fantastic music. And with the advent of MTV, now it's getting to that point where there's a certain blossom for good or bad that's starting to occur within the industry. But yeah, Motorhead, No Sleep Till Hammersmith. This is another one of those classic live albums. I can't find much information as far as too much studio doctoring. When you listen to it, it sounds raucous and raw. Kicking off the album, Ace of Spades. You just, right off the bat, you're getting slammed in the face. This was released in June 22nd, 1981 on Bronze Records. And believe it or not, it actually peaked at #1 on the UK charts for its release. Just kind of, I guess, signifying how much appreciation our friends over in the UK have for their heavy music. Buying and supporting a band like Motorhead and just, putting them up into that level. Another band that jumped out that year as well was SAXON. this has got even more of that fantastic classic album. This is, part of that trilogy of classic albums, as we've mentioned with a bunch of bands. You started off with Strong Arm and the Law, kicked over to Wheels of Steel. Now you've got Denim and Leather to kind of bookend those three classic albums. It's not short of anything that's great. I mean, it kicks off with Princess of the Night. The closing song is, the track Denim and Leather. Never Surrender, Out of Control. There's so many freaking great songs that are on this album, and anybody that is a fan of Saxon knows that this is another one of those high honor albums that you hold in great esteem, and put above many other albums from other bands, because it's just, like I say, it's part of that trinity of great albums from them at the time.
To add to Ian's points about the Motorhead album, No Sleep Till Hammersmith, I think this was also a period where the band was on the rise, and I think their fans were, let's say, expecting a live album. And I think they delivered this one, and it became one of those memorable albums where you could look back in time and say that was a peak of the band's career, captured in that live setting. And, it's nothing short of amazing that you can look back 40 or 50 years later and look back at an album and say that defines that band from that period of time. And they captured it in No Sleep Till Hammersmith for certain. I want to talk a little bit about Def Leppard, the release High and Dry. This was the second full release from Def Leppard. It was the last recording featuring guitarist Pete Willis, who he played on the album, but shortly after that, I guess the year after, in 1982, he was removed from the band due to alcohol abuse, and he was replaced by Phil Collen. I think this album has got a lot of classic elements to it. I think in thinking and painting the picture of the album cover, I mean, the image of the person standing outside an upside down pool that is empty. It's just, again, in one of those funny titles, and you say you're high in the air and the pool is dry. A little humor there. The album featured Mutt Lange as producer. He came in off the heels of his success on Back in Black from ACDC. The album itself is really known, let's say, for the legendary side one in the hard rock world. Songs such as the title track and Let It Go and Bring It On the Heartache. I think this album also was one that saw the band rising up in popularity. They were getting airplay on MTV. And I think you saw them more in a concert type setting on some of those early videos. And I think there was a big rise in popularity also because they had the opening slot on the Ozzy tour in the US. So I think in my takeaway on this is this was a really stellar album. It was probably their last really hard rock album before they started their transition into more the melodic style. And I think it was just a good album for that time. Regarding Judas Priest's Point of Entry, this was the 7th album from the band. And I think it was, let's be honest here, this was a tough act to follow, following up on, let's say, the heels of British Steel, which defined them commercially and successfully as a global band. This album is a little bit more radio friendly than it was, let's say, from British Steel. It was recorded in Spain, although some history here on the songs, that the songs were all pre-written and they really only just came into Spain to record the album. Now, interesting note there that further down the line, of course, Rob will admit to a heavy addiction of alcohol and drugs. And it seemed like one of the reasons the band recorded in Spain was because the booze was cheap. So I think you could see where this was going as the band continued in the early 80s. The cover, I think, is really, really cool. And there are actually 2 different covers. The US cover was sort of a simulation of a road where you had what looked like a straight line on a road. And it started out from the tip of, let's say, the automobile of a motorcycle, and you're seeing out at that horizon. Whereas the releases for the rest of the world had a different cover. And it came across as a very metallic in nature look, where you kind of appeared that you were looking from the inside of an airplane out, and you saw sort of the wing of a plane kind of hanging over the horizon of the sun. So both, I think, were really, really cool. I think the funny part about the album is the title. And if you think about a point of entry many, many years later when Rob Halford came out of the closet, I think fans and critics could look back and see to some of the album titles and the song titles that had a slightly different meaning. And I think, let's be honest, point of entry, we don't need to describe it, but I think we know what Rob meant in that. And I think that really captures the album. I think, in my personal opinion, I think half the album was great, actually. And I think, although the other half of the album was good, I think it left me with a feeling of like the songs were unremarkable. But hey, any album that you can say that has Heading Out to the Highway, Hot Rock, and Desert Plains, and my favorite on the album, Solar Angels, is to me is a smash. So really, really good stuff on that one.
Hey, Walt, just want to quickly interject on that Def Leppard. Pete Willis did contribute some guitar parts to Pyromania. He was really eliminated from the band when pre-production and the started recording of Pyromania. And that High and Dry tour, they did open up for Blackfoot, who we're going to cover in the honorable mention section. I had a chance to see that tour in 81, and they had a nice 10-song set, and they split it 5 and 5. 5 from the On Through the Night album and 5 from the High and Dry. And you also mentioned about the MTV days starting off, and that medium really propelled that High and Dry to get popular because of the in-concert videos that they shot for that, the Let It Go and Saturday Night High and Dry and Bringing On the Heartbreak. So great roundup. Those are some great bands. And Judas Priest, Point of Entry. Not sure if that point of entry is reference to what you're implying, but I enjoyed that album. It was refreshing, and I still visit it now and again. Ian, you got something on the docket. What are you ready to explore?
Well, we're knee deep in the UK already on this list, so we might as well continue there with Iron Maiden Killers. Produced by the legendary Martin Birch, starting off with the Ides of March, Into Wrathchild, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Killers, Drifter, Finito. Nothing really needs to be said. It is such a great album. It is a major step forward, in my opinion, from the first album. The first album was extremely raw. This was a little bit more fine-tuned by the band, probably getting a little bit of direction from Martin Birch along the way. They really, really were honing in on their craft. Unfortunately, this would be the final album with Mr. Diano, but I think that seeing where the band was going, it still could make sense why they were going to part ways with him and pick up Bruce Dickinson as their singer, because their trajectory was on that straight up line. These guys were ready to really make a name for themselves. And also, just a quick mention, they did also release a Live in Japan EP that year, which is one of those, it's another fun live album from these bands. There's not a lot of messing around with it. It's caught in the environment, and you get to catch the band, doing what they do best. It's Maiden. I mean, there's, now it's at that point, they're one of those bands that when you give a descriptive, like, well, it's Iron Maiden. Case in point, it's done. So yeah, Iron Maiden Killers, it's a fantastic album. I know that we're all fans of it here, so nothing more really needs to be said, I guess.
I will add this, and let's have a little friendly debate here. How about the album covers? I mean, Killer's album cover versus the debut release Iron Maiden album cover. I mean, both totally great. but you look at them back and forth and you say, which one's better than the next? I mean, iconic images all over the place, all over the merchandise, all over their T-shirts, plastered everywhere on ads, on metal sites all over the place. I take the nod to the Killers album cover. I think it's got a little more color, a little more context to it, and I see it building that mystique in the character of Eddie go forward that they'll continue through their career up until 2021 in actuality.
I totally agree. The Derek Riggs artwork is legendary, and you're right, Killers does smoke the first one. But then again, you know, look at the cover of Number of the Beast. It destroys Killers. You know, that's one of those bands, and that's part of what metal's about. The imagery sells, and we can't emphasize enough that back in the day, it went hand in hand. The music went with the artwork, went with the merchandise, it was a recipe for success. And Maiden, they wrote the recipe. So Iron Maiden, Rushmore bands in my book.
I've got to just add on that note, thinking back to all the guys with their denim jackets and the full back patches, I think the two full back patches that I saw the most were either the Killers album or the Number of the Beast album growing up, going to school. I mean, that iconic imagery is one of those things like that, you know, with guys with their battle jackets that will stick with you forever.
It was, or Twisted Sister. So it looks like the guys are going to do a little section of honorable mentions. Walt briefly touched on it in his opening. The guys are just going to go down this list, and it's a lot of bands that, you know, they're not the heavy hitters, but they still had their place in the history of metal. Walt, why don't you get this started? What do you got for honorable mentions?
Rainbow released Difficult to Cure in 1981. This enhanced their commercial sound that was building on the prior album with Graham Bonnet singing. It featured a new vocalist, guy from my own neck of the woods, Joe Turner from New Jersey. He was in a band called Fandango. But when you read up, you find that Richie Blackmore was really fascinated by the band Foreigner around that time, and they were at their pinnacle. And I think he tried to mimic the sound that Foreigner was bringing in here. So I think you see some of that. Again, from the album cover, it's kind of cool. You see these surgeons. There looks like 5 or 6 of them lining up in a little bowling pin type form, all wearing masks with one guy in the yellow glove up front, and looks like he's ready to go in and cut somebody open. Little known fact that I just discovered today in doing some research is that image was actually developed ahead of time by let's say an ad agency, and it was pitched to Black Sabbath as a potential album cover for Never Say Die, but not used and picked up by Rainbow. A great stellar release. You have songs like I Surrender, Spotlight Kid, Can't Happen Here. I mean, who can argue the lineup with Blackmore and Joe Turner, Roger Glover, Don Airey, and Bobby Randinelli? Great album, peaked at number 3 in the UK. I think you had a couple of others here. You had the Raven debut and the Anvil debut. I mean, Raven, Rock Until You Drop. It's a classic metal album. I think this was the introduction of the world for the Gallagher brothers. I think, you know, it just brings everything we love about Raven in there. The title track, Hard Rock, Hell Patrol, Tyrant of the Airwaves, among some of the other songs. And I think, again, painting the picture of the album cover, it's really, really funny. And we just did a segment last week on these guys, and you could see it in their humor. And this just shows on that album where it kind of shows the band members all looking like the stage collapsed on them and their equipment's all over the place and they're trapped under amplifiers and equipment and everything. So really good release. Anvil released Hard and Heavy. This was the debut album under the actual Anvil band name. I know something was released prior under the name Lips. I think the album cover too, it's just so classic and so symbolic of heavy metal, where you have the image of the anvil with the fire and the sparks and the hammer coming up above it. It speaks for metal right there. I do think it's a good album, although I don't necessarily think there's any great standout or memorable tracks that I think their better material comes later. But again, here it is, bringing the world of Steve Lips Ludlow and Rob Reiner out into the scene. Sammy Hagar, I think, released what probably would be his most well-known solo album, and that really is because there were many, many hit songs, and 5 actually charted in the U.S., and the album as a whole was certified platinum. The title of the album was called Standing Hampton, and I even had to reach back into some of the, let's say, the history of metal to try to find out what actually that meant, and was able to come up with the explanation that a fan actually told Sammy that the word Hampton is British slang for penis, and therefore the album really means standing erection, and the image ties that into it because you see these various women in various shapes and forms sort of undressing. So a bit of a sexual innuendo type album, which is funny. But again, I mean, listen, One Way to Rock, Heavy Metal, I'll Fall in Love Again, and Baby's on Fire, I mean, all great songs, and definitely his probably most memorable solo release. Y&T released Earthshaker. This was the first release under the actual moniker Y&T versus Yesterday and Today. It was also the first album that came out where they really took that approach towards hard rock and heavy metal style. And it featured the classic lineup of Dave Manichetti, Joey Alves, Phil Kennemore, and Leonard Hayes. A killer album, classic all the way through. Such good variety of material on this album. Dirty Girl, Rescue Me, Hurricane, the epic song that they still perform in concert to this day, I Believe in You. Just so much harmony and melody and guitar work in that. Just an amazing song. A big highlight for me in their catalog. And then I'll categorize the last few things as, let's say, the debuts of the 80s, right? For, you know, what would become later in the era as popular bands. You had Motley Crue releasing Too Fast for Love, and this was the first edition. The real release didn't come out in the States till around 1982, but it was released under a smaller label late in the year, only released 900 copies, but it got them on the roadmap. I think the imagery, again, was important on the album, where it really just showed the image of a guy's waistline with his kind of hand on his hips. He got the leather pants and the shirt and the belt, like total macho-looking image. And it kind of then led itself to see the image of the band with the makeup and kind of gave you the impression that they were going to have more of a glam band image. But in reality, it was a much harder edge sound through songs like, you know, Live Wire, the title track, and Public Enemy #1. Dokken released Breaking the Chains, also another similar story. It came out in a limited form in 81 on a French label, but it didn't do very well. It was picked up on a bigger label in the States, remixed and partially re-recorded, so that they kind of gave the album a kickstart. And it was an okay album, but I think really the band didn't grow until a few years later when they released Tooth and Nail. But again, the title track would probably be the most memorable, and I guess maybe the other track there was at the time called Paris, which again, we all know they changed the name to Paris is Burning. So, and then amongst the last, I think worth calling out is Baltimore-based 80s band Kix with their self-titled release. And this is a band that I've said this all along. They really are underappreciated. They're that really classic sound of part ACDC, part 80s hair band, and just a really good, solid lineup, you know, really good members. And even to this day, I think at least 4/5 of the band is still intact. It was released on a major label, Atlantic, and it featured, let's say, the memorable songs, The Itch, and a big show closer for them, Yeah. So that would be my honorable mentions. As we've said before, there'd be another dozen more we could cover, but we can't cover them all. Ian, what do you got?
I got to kick it right off with not one, but two bands from New York, or New York and New York State. Okay, you've got Riot, had Fire Down Under, which is probably their most known album. It's safe to say at that point, because, you know, the original singers with the band, they are firing on all cylinders. Things are going very well at this particular point, at least so it would appear. The album kicks off, you know, you got classic songs, Swords and Tequila. Outlaw is another one. I hold this album in a high personal regard, so I definitely had to make sure I had it in the honorable mentions. The Rods had their second album, their self-titled album. These are boys from downstate in southern tier of New York. You know, they got roots that go all the way back to Ronnie Dio and his Elf years prior to joining Richie Blackmore's Rainbow. These guys, the two of them together, you know, I always said, you know, it was funny because at one point or another, Raven, the Rods, and Riot, you know, had, you know, interspersed with, you know, early touring connections with each other. back in the 80s. And, if, you could ever had the moment where you could get the three of them together, that the building would probably collapse, because I don't think it could contain that much power. The next big one I'm going to talk about is Blackfoot. They released their bookend Marauder, that classic 3 album that they had, Strikes, Tomcat, and Marauder. This is probably also the last of that classic Blackfoot heavy Southern rock sound, as they start going into the 80s more. The next album, Siago, sees them introducing more keyboards. The production gets a lot more poppy, which, ends up leading to a lot of dissent within the band, to the point where eventually Ricky Medlock is the only original member of Blackfoot left at that particular point. You also had Thin Lizzy, had the album Renegade. Great underappreciated album. It's, chock full of that classic Thin Lizzy sound, the twin guitars, the back and forth between, the hard rockers and, some of the more soulful ballady type stuff. They even throw in some quirky little numbers. Tigers of Pantang, they put out their final 2 albums, Spellbound and Crazy Nights. Final 2 albums that would be have John Sykes involved with them in this year. And these are great albums. Anybody that's into early new wave of British heavy metal, there's a lot of great stuff on there. UFO had The Wild, The Willing, and the Innocent, which is the next step in writing with Paul Tonka Chapman on lead guitar with the band. They continued to still motor along and do their stuff. This would be the final hiccup before Pete Way depart to kind of almost join Fastway with Fast Eddie Clark, but never really joins the band, and then starts his own band, Wasted, instead. Venom, we have the incarnation of black metal coming, or at least the early incarnations of black metal, and, released Welcome to Hell. This is another classic new wave of British heavy metal album. I was never, ever a huge fan of the production, but that was, I think, intentionally done by the band to bring out even that much more raw and raucous temperament to the sound when you were listening to it. And it really kind of does make you feel like you're walking through hell. And the last one on my list, Michael Schenker Group released their second album, MSG. This is Schenker just continuing to be the mad axe man that he is, and blazing along with some more great material. It's another album that, I really didn't get into until later in life, but if given the opportunity to, do yourself a chance, go back and check it out, because I think it would be something that you would definitely appreciate. And that's what I got for my honorable mentions.
Blackfoot trying to introduce keyboards? What the hell were they thinking? That's not allowed in the South.
Yes, Siago. It was really, if you look at the cover art, you listen to some of the material. The name of the single that they released is escaping me at the time, but I mean, it was really fit right into the MTV image era that was going on at the time.
Some of our arena rock bands enjoyed some of their biggest albums ever. REO Speedwagon released the multi-platinum High Infidelity. It was filled with AOR staples that you hear to this day. Styx came around with Paradise Theater, and then a couple years later, they came around with Mr. Roboto, and they had some problems in the band. Kiss releasing The Elder. They weren't sure what they were doing, but it had a couple killer songs on there, The Oath. And I think the song I is on there. Walt, fact check me.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And Ted Nugent released the live album Intensities in 10 Cities. So, there was stuff going on, but those arena rock bands. Oh, and one more. Can't even believe I forgot this. Foreigner comes around with their Foreigner 4. Good work, guys. Way to round up the honorable mentions and get everyone up to speed. Right now, we're going to take a little break. And when we come back, Walt and Ian, they're going to crack the top 5 of the heavy hitters as the Vernomatic, Metal Walt, and Ian O'Rourke visits the history of metal, the year 1981.
Attention metalheads. Since we launched in 2019, Metal Mayhem ROC has been the go-to source for metalheads to talk about and hear the music they love. We can't thank you enough for being part of the family. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, hit subscribe so you know when we go live. Plus, tell folks why you like to listen when you leave a rating and review. If you're listening on another platform, head over to podchaser.com and type in Metal Mayhem ROC in the search bar. Hit subscribe, then rate the show and leave a comment on why you get your metal fix from the Vernomatic and his guests, Metal Mayhem ROC. Now, back to the show.
Just want to remind you folks to join us for Monday nights on the Metal Mayhem ROC live radio show. You can find it on thatmetalstation.com. Visit the website, metalmayhemroc.com, for direct links to that show. Speaking of shows, Metal Walt and Ian, they're going to crack the top 5 of the heavy hitters of 1981. Walt, who do you got in here?
Yeah, so this is always a tough thing to narrow things down to a top 10, a top 5. It's hard, but we did our best here. So I'm going to go with Black Sabbath's Mob Rules. Every metal fan in the planet knows Mob Rules. The image on the album, let's say faceless mob guys dressed in outfits with, hoods over their heads. You can't see what they're doing. There's just blood and all kinds of whips and whatever all over the place. There's an entry, a door. It looks like a bloody cloth over the top of it. You don't know what's going on, and spray painted on the back of the brick wall is Black Sabbath Mob Rules. Perfect album cover for the band. This is the second album featuring Ronnie James Dio, and the first featuring Vinny Appice. The album title was actually taken from the track Mob Rules, which was recorded prior to this album as a standalone song for the classic animated movie Heavy Metal, and then they just carried that song title over and made it the album cover. They actually re-recorded the song for the album, and it's a slightly different version. Generally, it's a strong album, but in my opinion, it features growth in the band in terms of, let's say, their expansion into certain pieces that are more epic in proportion, but it also features some direction into, let's say, some uncharacteristic melodic and catchy type short songs. As a big lifelong Sabbath junkie, I love this album, but I'm really not a great fan of songs like Turn Up the Night. I mean, even to a degree, the title track is cool, but I've heard it a million times. I think the album really expanded itself in terms of their songwriting and playing over Heaven and Hell, and that Heaven and Hell album was very, very hard to top. But you see the band getting closer in some ways, but then there's also the beginning of this variation of Sabbath spiraling out of control, perhaps for slightly different issues, but I think you had a division of power in the band between Tony Iommi and Ronnie James Dio. We all know Ronnie is a very headstrong guy. Also, it was admitted by both Geezer and Tony that drugs and alcohol were rampant still, and even the producer, Martin Birch, was kind of tied up in that drug exchange there too, and I think that led to inconsistencies in how the album ended up. I think after this, it led to the departure following the tour, which turned into the Live Evil album, and we'll cover that in the next episode, what happened behind the scenes in that album, which was really why both Vinny and Ronnie left and started the Dio band. But back to the album, I think you have my standout tracks would be, let's say, Voodoo. I think this is a different kind of song for Sabbath. It featured really, really strong, unique riffs, but it also had a very bluesy feel to it and some really fantastic soloing in the middle by Tony. I'm a big fan of that song. And probably my two favorite songs off the album, Falling Off the Edge of the World and The Sign of the Southern Cross. And this is where I tell you that this is where that band expands into those more epic pieces where they're a little bit longer in nature, but they're not those straight ahead rockers that just kind of come and go over a 4 to 5 minute period. There's a lot of changes in the music from the start of it. As the song evolves, it might start off a little slower or acoustic-y. It builds into that epic proportion, and there's a lot of ebbs and flows and ups and downs. Both songs have just amazing Tony riffs, fantastic solos, and I think those, to my opinion, are the top tracks of the album. And really, those three songs, including Voodoo, are, in my opinion, the standout tracks, along with some of the material from Heaven and Hell. ACDC, they released For Those About to Rock this year. And again, as I said in the introduction of the show, very, very hard for a band to follow up on the success of a massive album, because what can you do next? Well, I think they did it again. Lightning did strike twice, and this was the perfect 1-2 punch followed with this album. I think in this album itself, it was, when it peaked in the US, it was the first #1 album that they had ever had in the US, and they wouldn't really have another album in the top charts until I think the late, it was 2008 Black Ice or whatever that album was that came out. But again, record industry was dead at that point. Doesn't really matter. But this album at that time, I think, has sold already 4 million copies in the US, and that's just massive. 7 million, I think, globally, it said. I think the imagery of the album is worth calling out, just as importantly as the song, right? So I think, from the material on the album, I think you don't get as many, let's say, standout tracks that you can imagine in the AC/DC repertoire of material, let's say from a concert setting or a radio setting. But you do have the title track and songs like Let Me Put My Finger on You and Let's Get It Up, right? So those are the three big known songs. But I think what is interesting is around the imagery of the title track, the album title, and the album imagery of the canon, right? So the canon became, let's say, the centerpiece of AC/DC at the time. It defined them go forward as what they were as a concert artist. I mean, to this day, I don't think there's a show, well, there is a show, and I'll tell a little story on that, in which they have not performed that song as the final encore with the explosions. But a little known fact that I just discovered today about how the actual canon came into play. And in fact, when they were recording the album was the year in which Prince Charles and Lady Di were getting married. And apparently in the studio, they had the wedding on in the TV, and they had cannons going off at the wedding. Maybe it's a British tradition of royalty or something. And the band apparently raised their heads and looked at the TV, and they said, you know what? That sounds pretty damn cool. Why don't we bring that into the band? And that's how the whole imagery was started. So a great centerpiece to that. And I think, my final piece to this is a little personal story. As I said, the only time I've seen AC/DC, or maybe it's ever not been played, was at a club show they did around the time in the mid-2000s when they got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Well, this is an interesting fact, and this is an actual true story, that they were also re-releasing their catalog at that time from the Bon Scott years. And if you went to an independent record store on a certain day that the albums were released and you bought 2 re-releases, At $11.99 each, they gave you a free ticket to their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame concert at the Roseland Ballroom in New York City, which is now a long defunct club, a place that held, I think, 1,500 people. The tough part of it was the show was basically the next day. I was able to get myself a ticket. They introduced a lot of rare songs that they've never played again at that show. And because of the size of the venue, they couldn't do For Those About to Rock because of the explosions in the cannon. So I do recall they ended the show with You Shook Me All Night Long and walked out. And that may be the only time they've never played that song. So that's my recap of AC/DC. Ian, what you got?
So November 1981, the final release on Jet Records from Ozzy Osbourne with Randy Rhoads as his lead guitarist. The album was Diary of a Madman. Peaked at number 16 in the US and peaked at number 14 in the UK. So that's just gives you a little bit of a hint of how great this album is. It's literally one of those albums that is a put it on, play it beginning to end, Over the Mountain, Flying High Again, You Can't Kill Rock and Roll, Believer, Little Dolls, Tonight, SATO, and Diary of a Madman. I mean, it has to be listened to that way because it's that type of a classic album, and it's something that I think all of us as fans of hard rock metal and, you know, just the legacy of Ozzy and Randy. I mean, it's, you know, you owe it to yourself to try to listen to it every chance you get. Going from one guitar hero to another, we're going to talk about the fourth album from those Pasadena boys. We're talking Fair Warning from Van Halen. You can see where there is a difference now going forward in the sound. This was again done at Sunset Sound. But this was one of those albums because of how much they had been through and what was going on with the band and you know, pushing and pulling from, you know, inside the band and outside the band and, you know, backs against the wall, kind of trying to come up with some other new ideas. You know, they springboarded off some old ideas that have been around from those original demos that Eddie had, but then pulling in more new ideas to try to go into different directions. There was a lot of tension, at least between, you know, Eddie, Dave, and, you know, some comments that, you know, Eddie had made. You know, I think he was looking for anybody, including Dave or Michael Anthony, hoping that they were going to get more contributions for song ideas. But I still think that they delivered. You know, this album, you know, kicking off with Mean Streets, all the way through, you know, you flip it over, first song on side 2, the classic Unchained, you know, finishing off with One Foot Out the Door, that crazy Moog synthesizer riff going on, and Eddie coming in and just blazing through a ripping solo to close it out. I mean, it's everything that we had come to expect of Van Halen at that point. And yeah, you know, going forward, Diver Down, you know, we will discuss that. This is that the really that final album in that initial classic Van Halen sound, because things are going to start to deviate as we get going into the 80s and the advent of MTV and the introduction of more keyboards. So Fair Warning from Van Halen, I mean, it had to be on the list.
Oh, it definitely had to be on the list. Honestly, I love the album, but I think it was obvious that the well was getting dry. But like you said, side one of Fair Warning is fantastic. Mean Streets, again, like Ian said, there's bits of that from previous songs. Dirty Movies, now that's a different kind of song in terms of the way they wrote it. And you could probably comment further on this. The way Eddie recorded that song, he was doing multi-layering dubbing on the guitar. Is there something going on with that? Because that was something different than they've done in the past.
Yeah, the one, basic track in the beginning is him, kind of going through his, crazed, kind of fretted tapping, a la what he did the intro to Mean Streets. But he comes in playing the slide, and he had never really done a whole lot of slide playing. And one of the rumors was he actually had, and I think it was a 61 or a 62 Gibson SG that he cut the lower horn off. So if you ever see, like Tony Iommi or Angus play, it's got the two horns on the guitar. He couldn't reach his hand up enough with the slide. So he went into the other room, grabbed a hacksaw and cut the bottom horn off so he could reach up and get those higher frets with the slide. So there was a lot of stuff going on. But I mean, it's, that song alone, the way that was made and the way that it sounds, there's a dark, dirty street kind of vibe to that whole album. And that after Mean Streets, that just solidifies it right off the bat.
Yeah, Fair Warning. Again, my initial comment was, as a lifelong Van Halen fan and knowing what I know now as years and years of following the band, you could see the creative well drying up a little bit as the band moved away from that reliancy on the older material, and the relationship with Ted Templeman and Eddie Van Halen, that relationship was ending. So Sinner Swing, fantastic rocker, get shits and gets. Hear About It Later, legendary. And like you said, Unchained, big fan of So This Is Love. The standout track for me, Push Comes to Shove, gives me goosebumps. And, the filler, the ender, yep. 1 foot out the door, Sunday afternoon in the park, 1 foot out the door. So,
well, again, Vern, this is another, you think about it, they banged out all of their albums within short order and automatically went right on the road. So they had next to no time to break, which, I mean, you want to strike while the iron's hot, but maybe they needed to take a little bit of time. And I know that was something that they broached on later, as being a terse point with the band. So
Van Halen, Fair Warning. Ian, thank you. That was a great roundup. Good job. Walt, what do we got? We got the number one big dog of 81. What do we have?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that Van Halen segment, you could have put that at number one also, but I think, hey, listen, we got to end somewhere on the show. So we're going to talk about, Mount Rushmore, Rush, the Canadian band, and what they did and delivered to us hard rock and metal fans in 1981. You had two releases. You had Moving Pictures, followed by a live album, Exit Stage Left. So first off, on Moving Pictures, what's interesting to know was when they came off the road from Permanent Waves, believe it or not, they actually had enough ideas that ended up turning into songs on this album that were made during jams during the sound checks on the Permanent Waves. And you think about that, that's quite fascinating. As everybody knows, this was the band at its commercial peak. It blew them out into a whole different stardom, and it put them on the map, even bigger than that they were growing at the time. It's the album that Rush is known for. It'll always be the album that Rush is known for. For us uber geek fans, yes, we love it, but it's probably not the one we pull out of our CD shelf because we've just heard the album a million times over. The cover art. doing a little research, well, I knew this being a fan, is that actually the facility that's taken out in the picture is actually Ontario Legislative Building in Toronto. It's a government building. And actually, a couple of years ago, my family and I, we did a trip to Niagara Falls in Canada. I had one wish on my list was to do a half of a Rush day and hit all these really weird sites. And one of them was that. And to grab my Rush t-shirt and go stand on the front entrance and have one of my kids take a photo of me. Well, guess what? I wasn't the first Rush fan. I had to wait for somebody else to get out of my way, which that just tells you I can't even imagine how many other people have done that before. But side one of the album, I mean, I call this the side with the radio hits. It's the first 4 songs that everybody in creation knows. Probably anybody that's a musician has at some point started out playing one of those 4 songs. Side 2 is what I would categorize as the deeper tracks. There's only 3 songs on side 2, but they are epic ones. So I think a couple little facts about some of the songs on side 1. I think Red Barchetta is obviously written about Neil's fascination with vintage cars. It's about a 66 Ferrari, and it's, you know, based off some sort of book or poem he written about the imagery of a car driving through the mountainsides at high speeds and that kind of thing. YYZ, I don't know if this is a little known secret, but those are the acronym, or actually the 3-digit code for the Toronto International Airport. And the actual that actually is Morse. That's the Morse code for whatever it is, Toronto or something like that. And that's actually such a Neil Peart kind of thing to do, to make that beat coming off of Morse code for the words. Limelight, I think, is more introspective for Neil in the lyrics. I think this was, even to this day, when I hear the song, I think of him. This was his first, let's say, acknowledgement to the public through the eyes of his lyrics, his dissatisfaction of being sort of uncomfortable in the spotlight. He was a little quiet kid from Canada, a scholarly type kid, and he never really got the famous piece of it. And I think he was just uncomfortable till the end of his life. He stayed out of the public eye, left the concert venues on his motorcycles right after. He didn't feel like he was, let's say, worthy of getting all the attention that he did. And that's captured in some of the lyrics there. Side 2, you have Camera Eye. I think that's their epic song. I think it's, maybe at that time, it was their longest track, clocking in at over 10 minutes. And it's really based on trips that both Neil Peart took to both London, UK, and New York City. And he, you know, typical Neil kind of weird, quirky fashion, he did this compare-contrast piece comparing 2 different cities, from the feel to the culture to the vibe to the speed to the sounds. And you hear it in the trade-off of the songs, even right down the middle where it kind of breaks apart. And you could tell, if you knew nothing about the story, you could tell that there was a separation and it's going into a different part of the story. So for everybody out there, take that one back out and listen to it. And I think, of course, as you get to the end of the album, you got Witch Hunt, which is like what I call a classic heavy metal type riff, dark song. And then it ends with Vital Signs, which I think was what they would categorize as their pseudo reggae type song. But it was also a song that was heavily played on MTV. You saw the band in Lay Studios rehearsing. This was the first time I maybe seen Rush in that setting, where you had Neil Peart on, when he had his Montreal Expos hat on and his big headsets over his head and focused looking at the drums. So some just amazing things about this. This was an album that, you know, it was #1 in Canada, obviously, and it hit #3 on the Billboard charts in the US. And as I said, it just becomes it'll be known as their legacy. In 2010, on the Time Machine tour, they were coming back in between albums, and they decided to play a tour that had some deep tracks, a few new songs that were written for what would eventually become Clockwork Angels. But the whole focus of that tour was the second half of the show was going to be played Moving Pictures Complete. I was there. I saw that show. It was amazing and a memory. So Rush, Moving Pictures. Guys, what's your comments to this? You know the album. What do you got for me?
Rush, I've gone on record to say it's a photo finish in my history who my favorite band is, Van Halen or Rush. I think Moving Pictures is fantastic. It never gets old for me. Never. I just recently read an interview with Hugh Syme and Terry Brown their longtime art coordinator and their producer, talking about, Hugh was talking about when they're putting together the layout for the Exit Stage Left release, and they actually flew in that model that did the Permanent Waves girl. She was actually there, and that guy, the hemisphere naked guy, is actually the same guy from the Farewell to Kings, the dummy guy. So he's in there, and just the attention to detail, the continuity of the band in its history. And that's one of the things I just love about the band. We could go on all night, but that timestamp of 1981 in my life, I was discovering stuff left and right, and Moving Pictures, Exit Stage Left, Fair Warning, For Those About to Rock, Mob Rules, all these albums that we're talking about. In my eyes, these are like old lost friends.
If I could add to the point, just to, let's say, check off on Exit Stage Left. I mean, I think, again, I don't have to go through a ton of details on this, but it was obviously taken from the tours in 1980 and 81, recorded from shows in Scotland and Montreal, Canada. Again, I love that album as well, but I've been a critic of the sound quality of that album, and I think the band has acknowledged that as well. I think they almost polish it up a little too nice. It's too clean. It's not raw enough. It sounds too perfect. So I agree with them on that one. Something that, again, here's a couple little weird facts that pop up, right? That while they were in the studio evaluating the live recordings from those previous two tours, they started dabbling in the studio, writing new material. And one of the songs that actually was written and recorded during the whole selection of songs for Exit Stage Left was Subdivisions, which would come up a year later on their Signals album. I didn't even know that, to be honest, until today, till I saw that research. And another little piece is about the album title itself, which again shows back to the band's humor, that apparently at the time the band was into watching Hanna-Barbera's cartoon Snagglepuss, the little lion. And apparently that was a catchphrase that he always used when he got himself into some trouble, and then he wanted to get out of it and kind of get out of the scene with the other characters. And that was always the phrase he used, Exit Stage Left. And that's where they took it from. And as you said, Verno, this was kind of the centerpiece and the pinnacle of the band at that time. And for all of us Rush geeks, right, we can kind of categorize the band into maybe 3 or 4 categories. And I think this was end of phase 1 of Rush. Exit Stage Left ends. They come back in a year or two later with Signals. The sound starts to change. The image of the band starts to change. The sound of hard rock and heavy metal music, more synths in there, more keyboards, little things coming in. Rush jumps on the bandwagon. They take it into the middle to the late 80s, but not to get into that now. But the point of it is, this was end of era 1 for Rush. And that's the bottom line. And they delivered 2 just amazing classic albums. How can you end it any other way?
To piggyback off what Verno said, the Van Halen and the Rush music, even though it's different in its actual scope, but the explosion of creativity and the power that they possessed, and they run parallels up through the 80s as well. By the time Rush really starts going into the direction with the heavy keyboards, you start seeing Van Halen deterring into the Sammy Hagar, more radio-friendly pop keyboard era. And then they kind of all circle back around. Rush continues to put out, a lot of great albums, and stuff like that. But there's that middle period where, love it or hate it, as a fan, you still listen to it because, well, it's part of the dictionary of the band. So I love Rush.
We all love Rush. So Walt and Ian, thank you for spending the evening with me.
You're quite welcome. I think this is a good, passionate discussion. And I think we can all see where our love for these bands lies and how much it means to us as people and fellow metalheads. So just another great time, guys. And I can't wait for 82.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap this up. Just a quick reminder, Monday nights, the live radio show on thatmetalstation.com. Visit the metalmayhemroc.com website for details. There, also click on the podchaser.com link. Go there, leave a review of this podcast, subscribe, and, rate the episodes. That kind of stuff really helps. For Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke, I'm the Vernomatic. This is Metal Mayhem ROC. Keep it heavy.
Metal for life.
Thanks for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our websites at metalmayhemroc.com and metalforever.com for information on upcoming concerts, podcasts, archives, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. Catch us next time on WLFE DB Radio.